Ma'am, we've had a complaint. You need to move along.
I'm a paying customer working quietly. What's the issue?
Staff says you're making people uneasy. Leave, now.
Officer, you should verify the facts before you escalate this.
Is that a threat? Who do you think you are?
I'm a U.S. Marshal.
I don't care. Get out.
Then maybe you should.
Please.
Officer Marcus Reid had been with the local police department for 11 years when he walked into a situation that would end his career and cost the city $3.5 million. He was 38 years old, experienced enough to recognize federal authority, but apparently convinced his instincts overrode protocol. One quiet weekday morning in a neighborhood coffee shop, he responded to a vague complaint about someone who didn't belong. That someone was U.S. Marshal Diane Carter, a decorated federal officer with 14 years of service, sitting alone with her laptop and coffee, reviewing case files. What Reid did next, dismissing her credentials, ignoring witnesses, and forcibly removing her in front of stunned customers, would become a national symbol of how racial bias weaponizes authority and destroys trust. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. The coffee shop on Maple Street had the kind of morning rhythm that made it easy to disappear into your own world. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the steam rising from ceramic mugs. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled behind the counter while a handful of regulars claimed their usual spots: the corner booth, the high top by the window, the worn leather chair near the fireplace. Conversations hummed at low volume, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the click of laptop keys. It was the kind of place where people came to work, to think, or simply to exist without explanation. Diane Carter sat at a small round table near the window, her laptop open, a half-finished latte cooling beside a spiral notebook. She'd arrived just after 9, ordered her usual, and settled into the kind of focused quiet that comes from years of discipline. Her tan blazer was draped over the chair back, her badge and credentials tucked securely in the inner pocket. On the screen in front of her were case files, witness statements, and a meeting agenda she'd been reviewing for the past 20 minutes. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just another professional doing work in a public space. She'd chosen this coffee shop deliberately. It was close to the federal courthouse, had reliable Wi-Fi, and the staff had always been friendly. She'd been here dozens of times before, sometimes alone, sometimes meeting colleagues. Today was supposed to be routine. Finish her prep work, grab a refill, and head to her appointment across town. She wasn't bothering anyone. She wasn't drawing attention. She was simply existing in the way people do when they have work to finish and a little time to spare. Around her, life continued in its ordinary patterns. A young woman in headphones typed rapidly on her phone. An older man read the newspaper with reading glasses perched on his nose. Two students shared a table, textbooks spread between them, whispering about an upcoming exam. The barista called out names as drinks appeared on the counter. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. Diane took a sip of her latte, made a note in her notebook, and glanced at the time. She had another 30 minutes before she needed to leave. Plenty of time. She leaned back slightly, stretching her shoulders, and returned her attention to the screen. She had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, her ordinary morning would shatter into something unrecognizable, captured on multiple phones, and replayed millions of times across the country. The shift manager, a 24-year-old named Kevin Torres, had been behind the counter for 3 hours when the complaint came. It wasn't a complaint in the traditional sense. No raised voices, no specific incident, no clear violation of policy. It was more of a feeling, expressed by a middle-aged woman who leaned across the counter and lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. She didn't like the way someone was sitting. She didn't think they belonged. She couldn't quite say why, but something felt off. The woman at the window table, the one in the blazer with the laptop. She'd been there too long, looked too serious, seemed out of place. Kevin glanced over at the table in question. He saw exactly what he'd seen 20 minutes earlier when he delivered the latte himself. A professional woman working quietly, bothering no one, causing no disruption. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't lingered without purchasing. She wasn't blocking tables or making a scene. She was doing exactly what dozens of other customers did every single day. But the complaint had been made, and the woman who made it was standing there waiting for a response, her arms crossed, her expression expectant. He hesitated. Part of him knew this was ridiculous. Part of him wanted to say that being uncomfortable wasn't the same as being threatened, that feelings didn't constitute evidence, that someone sitting quietly with a laptop wasn't suspicious just because they didn't match someone else's mental picture of who belonged. But he was young, uncertain of his authority, and conditioned to treat customer complaints as legitimate even when they weren't. He told the woman he'd handle it. He didn't specify how. Instead of approaching the table himself, instead of making a judgment call based on observation rather than assumption, Kevin did what felt safest in the moment. He called the police. He reported a possible loitering situation, someone who'd been in the shop for an extended period and was making customers uncomfortable. He didn't mention that she'd purchased a drink. He didn't mention that she wasn't violating any policy. He framed it the way the complaint had been framed to him, as a vague sense of unease that required official intervention. The call was logged. The dispatch went out. And within minutes, Officer Marcus Reid was on his way, armed with incomplete information, unchecked assumptions, and the unshakable belief that his presence alone would resolve whatever minor disturbance awaited him. Officer Marcus Reid pulled into the parking lot with the casual confidence of someone who'd handled 1,000 calls just like this one. Loitering complaint. Uncomfortable customer. Probably nothing serious, but it needed a presence, a uniform, a reminder that authority could be summoned when people didn't know their place. He'd been doing this for 11 years, long enough to develop instincts he trusted more than he should have, long enough to believe he could size up a situation in seconds and know exactly what needed to happen. He pushed through the coffee shop door, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. The usual morning crowd, students, retirees, people hunched over laptops pretending to work. His gaze swept past the counter, past the tables near the door, and landed on the woman by the window. She was exactly what dispatch had suggested without saying it outright. Professional attire, focused expression, sitting alone in a neighborhood spot where most faces were familiar. She didn't fit the unspoken profile of who belonged, and that was enough. Reid didn't pause to observe. He didn't take a moment to assess whether there was actually a problem or just a perception of one. He didn't glance at the empty coffee cup on her table or notice the work spread out in front of her. He simply walked directly toward her, his stride purposeful, his jaw set, his hand resting casually near his belt in a posture that communicated authority before he'd said a single word. The conversations around him dropped to whispers. Heads turned. The barista froze mid-pour. Everyone could feel the shift in the room, the way normalcy curdled into tension the moment a uniform entered with intent. Diane looked up from her screen, her expression calm but alert, already reading the situation with the trained awareness of someone who'd spent years navigating rooms where her presence was questioned. Reid stopped at her table, standing over her in a way that forced her to look up, that turned the interaction into a power display before it had even begun. His tone was flat, dismissive, stripped of the courtesy he might have extended to someone else. He didn't ask if there was a problem. He didn't introduce himself or explain why he was there. He simply delivered his opening line with the assumption that his authority was self-evident and her compliance was guaranteed. The conversation that followed would be recorded on 4 different phones, dissected in courtrooms, and replayed millions of times. But in that moment, Reid believed he was in complete control. Reid's opening words landed like an accusation dressed as a request. "Ma'am, we've had a complaint. You need to move along." No greeting, no inquiry, no acknowledgement that she might have a legitimate reason to be there. Just an order, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. Diane looked up at him, her expression measured, her voice steady. "I'm a paying customer working quietly. What's the issue?" She gestured subtly to the laptop, the notebook, the coffee cup with the shop's logo still visible on the side. Reid didn't glance at the evidence. He didn't ask to see a receipt or verify her purchase with the staff standing 20 feet away. He simply repeated the script he'd already decided to follow. Staff says you're making people uneasy. Leave. No. The words were clipped, final, designed to shut down conversation rather than invite it. Around them, the coffee shop had gone almost silent. Laptops sat untouched. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones began to rise, cameras turning toward the confrontation unfolding by the window. Diane's training kicked in, the years of de-escalation protocols and procedural discipline that had carried her through far more dangerous situations than this. Officer, you should verify the facts before you escalate this. Her tone was professional, firm but not aggressive, offering him an exit ramp he could take without losing face. She wasn't challenging his authority. She was reminding him that authority required accuracy, that power without information was just intimidation. But Reid heard it differently. He heard defiance. He heard someone questioning his judgment in front of witnesses, and that shifted something in his posture, in the edge that crept into his voice. Is that a threat? Who do you think you are? The question was rhetorical, dismissive, meant to put her back in what he considered her proper place. He wasn't interested in who she was. He'd already decided what she was, someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be reminded that his word carried weight. Diane met his eyes, her voice calm and clear. I'm a U.S. Marshal. The statement hung in the air for a beat, offering him one last chance to pause, to verify, to recognize that he was about to cross a line he couldn't uncross. Reid's response was immediate, reflexive, and catastrophic. I don't care. Get out. He didn't ask for credentials. He didn't call for verification. He simply dismissed federal authority as irrelevant and escalated toward removal. Diane reached slowly toward the blazer draped over her chair, her movements deliberate and visible, the kind of careful choreography that kept situations from exploding. Officer, I can show you my credentials. My badge is in my jacket. Just let me reach for it. She kept her hands where he could see them, her voice steady, offering him the verification he should have requested from the beginning. This was the moment where protocol dictated pause, where training required confirmation, where any reasonable officer would step back and allow federal identification to be presented. Reid's hand moved toward his belt, his body language shifting into a defensive posture that signaled distrust rather than caution. Stop right there. Don't reach for anything. His voice had an edge now, sharp and certain, as if her attempt to provide proof was itself suspicious. Diane froze, her hand still extended but motionless, her eyes locked on his. Officer, I'm telling you I'm a U.S. Marshal. I need to show you my credentials so we can resolve this professionally. But Reid had already made his decision. He'd decided the moment he walked through the door, maybe even before that, in the seconds after dispatch described the complaint. Whatever she was about to show him, whatever identification she claimed to have, it didn't matter. I don't believe you. You can show me whatever fake ID you want. You're leaving this coffee shop right now. The accusation was stunning in its certainty. He wasn't just dismissing her authority, he was preemptively declaring her credentials fraudulent without ever looking at them. Around them, phones were fully raised now, recording every word, every gesture. The barista stood frozen behind the counter, uncertain whether to intervene. A customer near the door had already dialed a number, quietly reporting the incident to someone off-screen. Diane felt the weight of the moment, the familiar exhaustion of knowing that professionalism wouldn't protect her, that credentials meant nothing when they came from someone whose presence was questioned before they'd done anything wrong. She kept her voice level, documented the refusal in clear terms that would matter later. Officer, I am identifying myself as a federal law enforcement officer and you are refusing to verify my credentials. That's a violation of protocol. Reid's response was immediate and dismissive. I don't care what you say you are. You're trespassing and you're leaving. No. He reached for his radio, calling for backup, escalating a situation that required only a badge check into something that would end careers and cost millions. The coffee shop had transformed into an impromptu courtroom, with a dozen witnesses documenting every second of what was rapidly becoming an arrest. Phones were raised at multiple angles, capturing Reid's body language, Diane's composure, and the growing unease rippling through the crowd. A college student near the fireplace was streaming live to social media. An older woman by the door had already sent the first clip to her daughter with a caption that would be shared thousands of times within the hour. This wasn't a private confrontation anymore. It was public record, preserved in real time, distributed before it had even finished. Reid seemed oblivious to the cameras or convinced they didn't matter. He keyed his radio and requested backup for a trespassing removal, his voice official and detached, as if he were handling routine business rather than forcibly ejecting a federal officer from a coffee shop. Diane remained seated, her hands visible on the table, her posture deliberately non-threatening. She knew what this was now. She knew how it would play out. The question wasn't whether she'd be removed. That was already decided in Reid's mind. The question was how much damage he'd do to himself and his department in the process. "Ma'am, stand up. You're coming with me." Reid's hand moved to his handcuffs, the universal signal that compliance was no longer optional. Several customers gasped audibly. The barista finally found her voice, calling out from behind the counter that the woman had paid, that she hadn't caused any problems, that maybe there was a misunderstanding. Reid ignored her completely, his attention fixed on Diane with the single-minded focus of someone who'd convinced himself he was right and everyone else was wrong. Diane stood slowly, her movements measured and controlled. "Officer, I am complying under protest. You are unlawfully detaining a federal officer. I will be filing a formal complaint." Her words were calm but carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what laws were being broken and what consequences would follow. Reid moved behind her, reaching for her wrist. "Put your hands behind your back." The physical contact sent a new wave of tension through the room. A man near the window stood up as if to intervene but was pulled back down by his companion. The barista was on her phone now, speaking rapidly to someone in management. Other customers were texting, posting, calling friends. The incident was already viral before Diane was even escorted toward the door. The footage hit social media before Diane even reached the police station. By the time Reid was completing his paperwork, categorizing the incident as a routine trespassing removal with resisting language that would later be proven false, the video had been viewed 17,000 times. By the time his supervisor saw the notifications lighting up the department's public relations line, it had crossed 100,000. And by the time someone in the chain of command thought to actually verify the identity of the woman Reid had arrested, the clip was national news. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan was the first to make the call that should have been made an hour earlier. She pulled Diane's information from the arrest log, cross-referenced it with federal databases, and felt her stomach drop when the confirmation came back. U.S. Marshal. 14 years of service. Decorated record. Currently assigned to the district's fugitive task force. Active credentials. No warrants. No flags. Nothing that would justify what had just happened in a coffee shop on Maple Street. Brennan walked into the holding area where Diane sat, still handcuffed, her blazer folded beside her, her expression unreadable. The lieutenant's face said everything before she spoke. "Marshal Carter, I am so sorry. This should never have happened." She signaled for the cuffs to be removed immediately, her movements sharp with urgency and barely contained anger. Diane rubbed her wrists slowly, her silence more damning than any accusation she could have voiced. Within 20 minutes, the chief of police was on the phone with the U.S. Marshal Service, delivering apologies that sounded hollow even as they were spoken. Within an hour, Reid was pulled from patrol and placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Within 2 hours, the mayor's office was drafting a statement. The coffee shop's corporate headquarters issued a public apology before the sun set, promising policy reviews and bias training that everyone knew wouldn't undo what had been done. The internal affairs investigation moved with unusual speed, driven by the undeniable clarity of multiple video recordings and the catastrophic optics of a local officer dismissing federal credentials and arresting a decorated marshal for the crime of existing while black in a public space. There were no ambiguities to parse, no competing narratives to weigh. Reid had been given multiple opportunities to verify, to pause, to follow protocol. He'd chosen certainty over evidence, assumption over procedure, and ego over law. The video accumulated 12 million views in 72 hours. It was dissected on cable news, analyzed by legal experts, shared by civil rights organizations, and replayed in endless loops across every platform that trafficked in outrage and accountability. The footage was damning not just for what it showed but for what it represented. A pattern so familiar it had become predictable, a script so worn it barely needed narration. Black professional. Public space. Vague complaint. Immediate escalation. Dismissed credentials. Forcible removal. The only variable was whether cameras would be present to document what happened when authority collided with bias. Public pressure mounted with the speed and force of a flash flood. Protests organized outside the police station and city hall. National civil rights leaders issued statements. The U.S. Marshal Service released a terse comment expressing full support for Marshal Carter and concern about the treatment of federal officers in the field. Editorial boards called for accountability. Social media demanded consequences that went beyond statements and apologies. The department, already struggling with community trust issues, couldn't afford to protect Reid even if it wanted to. The internal affairs investigation concluded in 2 weeks with findings that were as conclusive as they were damning. Reid had violated multiple departmental policies, failed to follow verification procedures for claimed law enforcement credentials, ignored witness testimony, filed a false report, and demonstrated clear bias in his handling of the incident. 3 weeks after the coffee shop confrontation, Officer Marcus Reid was terminated from the police department. His 11-year career ending not with honors but with a personnel file that would follow him into any future employment. Diane filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging racial profiling, unlawful detention, false arrest, and violation of her 4th and 14th Amendment rights. Her legal team assembled a case that was essentially airtight. Video evidence from multiple angles, witness testimony, documented refusal to verify credentials, Reid's disciplinary history showing 3 prior complaints involving racial bias, and the coffee shop's own admission that she'd been a paying customer who violated no policies. The city's legal department reviewed the evidence and recognized immediately that this case was indefensible. 6 months after the incident, they settled for $3.5 million, one of the largest civil rights settlements in the city's history. The agreement included no admission of liability, but the price tag spoke louder than any statement. The mayor announced the settlement alongside promises of policy reforms, bias training, and accountability measures that advocates noted should have existed already. The settlement forced conversations that had been avoided for years. The police department implemented new protocols requiring officers to verify law enforcement credentials before taking any enforcement action, to document their reasoning for all detentions, and to undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation. Supervisors were required to review body camera footage from incidents involving complaints of discrimination. A civilian oversight board gained expanded authority to investigate patterns of biased policing. On paper, the reforms looked comprehensive. In practice, their effectiveness would depend on whether they were enforced with the same certainty that had been applied to Diane's removal from a coffee shop. The coffee shop chain launched a nationwide initiative addressing how employees should handle complaints rooted in discomfort rather than behavior. Managers received training on recognizing bias-based concerns and were explicitly instructed that feeling uncomfortable about someone's presence was not grounds for removal if that person was a paying customer following all posted rules. The program was well-intentioned but arrived only after millions in settlement costs and irreparable damage to trust. For Diane Carter, the aftermath was complicated in ways that settlements and policy changes couldn't address. She returned to work, continued her service as a U.S. Marshal, and maintained the professionalism that had defined her career. But the incident lived on in ways both public and private. She couldn't walk into a coffee shop without awareness, couldn't sit in a public space without calculation, couldn't exist in ordinary moments without the knowledge that her credentials, her service, her dignity could be dismissed in an instant by someone with a badge and an assumption. The case became a reference point in training academies, law schools, and civil rights seminars. It was cited in policy briefs and congressional testimony. It appeared in documentaries about racial profiling and the weaponization of authority. But beyond the citations and the settlements and the reforms, it remained what it had always been, a reminder that belonging in America is conditional for some, that professionalism offers no immunity from bias, and that the distance between an ordinary morning and a national scandal is often just one complaint, one officer, and one refusal to see someone as they actually are. The real question wasn't whether Officer Marcus Reid had been held accountable. It was whether the system that produced him, protected him, and enabled him would transform in ways that prevented the next incident from happening at all.